This is the crew patch. It shows SLS-1, Space Lab Life Sciences 1 as the logo. And this is what it looked like on the 5th of June that morning before we suited up. This is the crew in the suit room. We'd been through this once before, about 4 days prior, where we had gone out to the launch pad and had an abort due to an IMU problem. So by now we were getting kind of used to this routine. And as you see, the various crew members loading their pockets with the emergency equipment, putting the suits on. It may not show here, but we were really ready to go.
After several scrubs, it was time to fly. On launch day, Columbia performed flawlessly. Initially, you may recall the weather was no-go due to some low clouds, thunderstorms, and fog in the area. But after about an hour and a half of hold, a blue speck formed to the west. It moved over the pad, grew in size, and eventually we were cleared to launch. The SSMEs throttled to 100%, but when the SRBs lit, that's when we really knew we were going into orbit. We rolled to a 39-degree inclination to set us up for our flight. In first stage, we really knew we were flying a rocket. It was a solid E-ticket. Despite the hole in the sky, we did penetrate a cloud layer at about 14,000 to 16,000 feet. It was well within launch commit criteria, and it creates some beautiful imagery. You'll see a shadow formed by the sun falling on the rocket plume. You can see the shadow going off to the left there.
We opened the payload bay doors about 2 hours after launch to reveal just a spectacular view of the Earth. We also have a clear view of the Space Lab in the payload bay. The Space Lab was affectionately deemed slave quarters about halfway through the mission.
After we had configured the orbiter for space activities, we got to work activating the Space Lab. We spent about 2 hours setting up, checking out the environmental control system, the computers, and the communication systems. You'll see Sid as he heads back across the tunnel that we had to open to get back into Space Lab. After we performed the activation, we got to work on setting up all of the experiment hardware itself. Here you get to see the first view of the first working laboratory in space dedicated to the life sciences. You'll see the experiment hardware in racks along the sidewalls. We have overhead stowage containers and several pieces of equipment down the center aisle.
This is Jim performing an exercise test. You can see him breathing on a bag. That system with a gas analyzer allowed us to measure how much the body consumed in terms of oxygen, how much carbon dioxide it produced, and how exercise was affected during zero-G, and then compare that with pre- and post-flight. This was done in conjunction with the State University of New York at Buffalo and UT Southwestern in Dallas. This was the first time that we've actually measured maximal exercise capacity. This is, you see Ray and me doing an echocardiogram. This is an ultrasound test that allows us to image the heart, and with that we can see how much fluid shift has occurred, how the heart is expanded, and how well it's functioning in zero-G.
One of the other core experiments we had was the pulmonary function test experiment, and that was sponsored by the University of California at San Diego. And what we're measuring here is differences in the way the lungs function in weightlessness and how gases exchanged in weightlessness versus on 1G here on Earth. All the crew participated in that experiment. Here's Drew doing the baroreflex experiment. And what this does is it puts various amounts of pressure on your neck at the pressure receptors that help govern your blood pressure, and by understanding how we change our ability to regulate blood pressure in orbit versus here, it gives us a better handle on the kind of problems we see during entry with blood pressure regulation.
This experiment was designed to look at changes in blood flow and the compliance of blood vessels in the lower extremity in zero-G. It's also from the University of Texas in Dallas. Blood pressure cuff is pumped up on the thigh, and then we measure changes in size of the calf.
Here I am spinning Jim in the rotating chair. We're testing his vestibular response in zero gravity. This was sponsored by MIT. It's much like going in a merry-go-round. When you stop suddenly and throw your head down, we're testing to see how quickly we get rid of that opposite reversal spin that we feel. In this experiment, we instead of our rotating, we put our head into a dome that's rotating, and then we measure the response by looking at how the eye responds to the feeling of vection. And we compare this to our responses on the ground.
The orbiter crew members volunteered to participate in a number of Space Lab experiments. We renamed them for simplicity. This particular experiment is officially called BMMD, or Body Mass Measuring Device. We called it Weighing Yourself. Several other experiments, the one you recall with the collar, we renamed that one Suck on Your Neck. It was officially the Barrel Reflex. And the pulmonary function test we called Blow in the Pipe. One of the advantages to working in space is the short drive time between your work and your home. Here you see it's about 15 to 20 seconds to get from the Space Lab back to the orbiter. This is Jim and Tammy transiting the tunnel. In addition to the primary experiments, we conducted many secondary experiments, including 12 getaway special or gas cans. They were activated from the flight deck, but they were actually located back behind the Space Lab. They included investigations of material science, plant biology, and cosmic radiation.
One of the other things that we in the orbiter crew spent a lot of time doing during the mission was measuring the air quality. This is one of several experiments that gathered in air samples and looked for things like microbes and particles. We also checked the sound levels in the vehicle. This is Sid. Looks like he's looking for water, but he's not. What he's doing is measuring the sound levels, and we did this on the flight deck, the mid-deck, and also back in the Space Lab.
On day 7, we conducted the Orbital Acceleration Research Experiment. We flew a number of maneuvers, including a loop, aileron roll, and a 360-degree flat turn. I'll challenge some of the pilots on Earth to match that last maneuver. We were studying the performance of a miniature electrostatic accelerometer device. We also installed an improved filter to help the performance of the humidity separator. It was located under the middeck, or down in the pit, as we called it, and this yielded some surprising information about fluid flow in a zero-G environment.
Bryan and Sid are here preparing to do some Earth observations. We photograph the land, the water, and the clouds, not just for aesthetic reasons, but for the wealth of scientific data the photographs contain. Here we're passing through the Strait of Gibraltar. We're going obviously west to east, and on the left-hand side you see Spain, and the right-hand side is Morocco. The Mediterranean Sea is in the distance. Here we have a very nice view of southern Italy, including the island of Sicily. Next we'll be approaching Kuwait, and soon you'll have an unmistakable view of the oil fires that still persist in the Kuwaiti oil fields since the war.
Since I live in San Francisco, the California coastline was one of my favorite views out the window. And UC Berkeley was also another favorite view for all of us, since many of us went to UC Berkeley. Down the peninsula we can see NASA Ames Research Center that had a lot of the research animals on board.
And coming up in the distance, you can see just about center of the screen to the right is the dry lake beds and the Edwards complex there, which we were going to land at about 4 days from the time we took this photo. Here's the East Coast coming up, and there's the Appalachians just going by the edge of the Palo Bay. You can see the Chesapeake Bay near the center right at the bottom, and the Delmarva Peninsula above that. You can see New Jersey, Delaware Bay, and up to the Philadelphia area, Manhattan Island, Long Island, and all the way up, in fact, to Cape Cod, and that was a pretty nice sight.
One of the hardware test objectives that we flew on this flight for the Ames Research Center was to see if particulates and liquids could be contained within this general purpose workstation. Here you see me squirting strawberry punch out of a drink container, and you can see that the fluid tended to want to stick on the walls. The particulates that we released from this balloon were entrained a little bit in the airflow, which goes from the top of the cabinet down to the bottom.
We showed that we can handle the cages and keep the rats healthy, but we also wanted to be sure that the animals could be handled and taken care of and worked with as they are on Earth. And it turns out it's exactly the same. The rats are very comfortable being held like this. This is what you do in a laboratory on Earth. Works the same in space.
Both rats and human beings lose both bone and muscle during space flight. And during our flight, we took many samples of blood in order to test the changes in the hormones in our blood systems during flight. And we believe that that perhaps is part of the reason we're losing the bone and the muscle during flight. And that was a nice exchange of tubes. It took at least 2 to 3 of us to do the blood draws because it was complicated.
This experiment uses lymphocytes, or white blood cells, to investigate changes in our immune system that occur when we leave the 1G environment of Earth for the 0G environment of space. Here we're injecting the cultures with a mitogen that promotes cell division, and by comparing our 1G control cultures in our centrifuge with our 0G cultures, we can determine if lymphocyte proliferation is decreased when you go to orbit, and thereby may adversely affect our immune system.
As many of you know, we had some trouble with the refrigerator and freezers during our flight, and here's a picture of Jim and Sid cleaning the filters in order to help the refrigerators and the freezers work more efficiently. This is where we put our blood samples, so it was a very important event to keep them running.
Here we're preparing to take some camcorder footage of our jellyfish crew members. Jellyfish contain gravity receptors that are analogous to the otolith organs in the inner ear. And by taking a look at the behavior of the jellyfish, whose gravity sensing organs have developed in 0G, we can compare that swimming behavior to their 1G counterparts. One thing that you'll notice here is that the jellyfish tend to swim in circles and arcs, whereas on the ground they simply swim to the top of the flask and float down. This is a test of the medical restraint system for possible use on space station. My brave patient Sid here is allowing his astrophysicist to test his reflexes. I told Sid if he didn't move his knee, I'd just have to hit him harder the next time. So he became more cooperative. And this is simply a demonstration of performing CPR in 0G. It is quite feasible. This is Recessa Annie that I'm performing the CPR procedure on, and she is strapped to the mid-deck lockers.
The breaking of bread in space took on added meaning on this flight since we were keeping track of all of our liquid and fluid intake for the metabolic studies that we were doing. We've kept track of everything that we've taken in from a few weeks before flight up until the present time. We're looking at changes in nutrient metabolism and probably in food preferences too. Here we are at a typical dinner beginning to chase our food around. And of course it was always a challenge even to try and stay clean on a 9-day flight without a good shower. Here Drew is shampooing his hair with a waterless shampoo that we had on board, and it worked pretty well, at least for people with short hair or no hair.
Yeah, I'll vouch for that. They had warned us that we know that various orbiters have slightly different sounds to them, and about midway in the mission we noticed a sound emanating, it seemed like from, we weren't sure where in the middeck, and trying to discover what it was. And Bryan and Tammy were looking around, and they seemed to finally locate it down in the LIO storage area there. But it turned out that, for some reason, Sid was down there. Well, once we had solved that problem about what was causing the noise, we really weren't too worried about it, so Tammy just buttoned it back up and went back to work. About the 6th day, everybody was ready for a little bit of recreation, and we knocked the bike back down in the stove position, and everybody kind of went back for a little bit of gym time back in the space lab. And here you'll see what we think is probably the world's record, and probably for the solar system too, the number of people on someone's back doing a push-up. Sid's on the bottom and Drew's on the top, and you can see Sid really pumping these push-ups out, but we think it was probably tougher on the people near the top like Drew and myself as we were slamming into the lockers overhead. And we did not stop because of Sid's lack of stamina, but rather Drew's pain threshold and my own probably.
The day before landing, we fired up one of the auxiliary power units and ran through a checkout of the orbiter flight control system and the RCS jets. Since brushing your teeth in 0G is difficult at best, we made liberal use of chewing gum to facilitate working in close quarters.
We closed the port payload bay door about 3 hours and 20 minutes prior to the deorbit burn. Soon you'll see evidence of possible interference of the environmental seal with the door closure, and also you can see the loose thermal blankets that Jim's going to talk more about later.
Then came entry day, or entry time. We all got dressed in our orange suits. This is Jim, who was rotating back and forth between middeck and flight deck, helping people get in their suits and so on. And here you see our two stalwart payload specialists in their suits ready for entry on the middeck. This is a shot taken out the top of the window, and you can see that phantasm that other people have reported where the ions are recombining behind the vehicle as you come down through the atmosphere, and you can see the reflection off of Sid's back there. We came down through entry, did several aerodynamic test inputs. The winds were nice, and we were scheduled to land on runway 22, the concrete runway at Edwards. One of the things that we had to do on this landing was to land a little faster than normal because we were a heavyweight vehicle. And also we did a high-speed nose wheel steering test to open up the envelope for the nose wheel steering system on the shuttle. As the nose comes down, you can see the big speed brakes out there on the top of the shuttle to help slow it down.
One of the things you probably saw on this flight different from all the other shuttle flights is that we didn't walk down the stairs out of the vehicle. This crew transport vehicle, which is an airport transfer bus, was outfitted so that we can get the crews out very quickly, get them changed, and start doing medical tests and look at the condition of the crew immediately on landing instead of the 45 to 90 minutes that it usually takes. This is really going to help us in the future to get the crews out quickly and get the medical studies that we need for planning our longer duration flights. Plank was not used.
Well, we're hearing from the scientists that we had a very successful mission scientifically. This is our crew when we posed for our picture months before the launch. The smiles reflect how we feel today about this flight and all the people that helped support it and make it go.
In first stage, we really knew we were flying a rocket. It was a solid E-ticket. Despite the hole in the sky, we did penetrate a cloud layer at about 14 to 16,000 feet. It was well within launch commit criteria, and it creates some beautiful imagery. You'll see a shadow formed by the sun falling on the rocket plume. You can see the shadow going off to the left there.
We opened the payload bay doors about 2 hours after launch to...
This is the crew patch. It shows SLS-1, Spacelab Life Sciences 1 as the logo. And this is what it looked like on the 5th of June that morning before we suited up. This is the crew in the suit room. We'd been through this once before, about 4 days prior, where we had gone out to the launch pad and had an abort due to an IMU problem. So by now we were getting kind of used to this routine. And as you see, the various crew members loading their pockets with the emergency equipment, putting the suits on. It may not show here, but we were really ready.
Here you get to see the first view of the first working laboratory in space dedicated to the life sciences. You'll see the experiment hardware in racks along the sidewalls. We have overhead stowage containers and several pieces of equipment down the center aisle.
This is Jim performing an exercise test. You can see him breathing on a bag. That system with a gas analyzer allowed us to measure how much the body consumed in terms of oxygen, how much carbon dioxide it produced, and how exercise was affected during zero-G, and then compare that with pre- and post-flight. This was done in conjunction.
Ready to go.
After several scrubs, it was time to fly. On launch day, Columbia performed flawlessly. Initially, you may recall the weather was no-go due to some low clouds, thunderstorms, and fog in the area. But after about an hour and a half of hold, a blue speck formed to the west. It moved over the pad, grew in size, and eventually we were cleared to launch. The SSMEs throttled to 100%, but when the SRBs lit, that's when we really knew we were going into orbit. We rolled to a 39-degree inclination to set us up for our flight.
Revealed just a spectacular view of the Earth. We also have a clear view of the Space Lab in the payload bay. The Space Lab was affectionately deemed slave quarters about halfway through the mission.
After we had configured the orbiter for space activities, we got to work activating the Space Lab. We spent about 2 hours setting up, checking out the environmental control system, the computers, and the communication systems. You'll see Sid as he heads back across the tunnel that we had to open to get back into Space Lab. After we performed the activation, we got to work on setting up all of the experiment hardware itself.